Welcome to the Executive Innovation Show podcast, where we bring you real executive conversations with industry game changers and thought leaders. We ask the questions you're thinking, what you're scared to ask, and we make your brain hurt afterward. With your host, Carrie Chitsey Wells, co-founder and CEO of One Touch Video Chat, live video interviews, and the nonprofit Humans Helping Humans.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's podcast. We have an amazing podcast today about hiring and developing leaders versus managers. We have two great guests on the show with us today. Our first guest is Amy Riccardi, who is the founder and CEO of Leadership Evolution Group, as well as the Chief People Officer at HCM 2020. For over 18 years, she's been working with CEOs and executives to fix complex problems in their organization. A critical factor of success is the leadership capabilities of the CEO. And to address this issue, she's writing a book called Leadership versus Management: Leadership Essentials You Must Master in 2020 and Beyond, which is coming out later this year in October. Our second guest on the show today is going to be Werner, who's the Senior Vice President and Global Talent for Korn, Ferry, based in Dallas. She also leads the organization's talent acquisition function, including pre-boarding, recruitment, onboarding strategy, and delivery globally. Prior to that, she was 7 years in progressive HR roles across a major executive search firm. Amy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Carrie. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, awesome. We've got some fun topics to talk about today. And I want to start, you work with a lot of C-level clients and human capital management and have been for quite some time. You've been working really on this concept of, leadership versus management and kind of the issues, as there's a big difference between the two. Explain to everyone that, might think that leadership and management is the same. Explain to everybody what are really the differences of leaders versus managers.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So I've been in management consulting actually for 25 years, had the business for the last 18. And, a lot of our clients come to us and have symptomatic problems in their organization. And so they want to do an employee engagement survey, or they want to work on competency, programs or hiring strategies or whatever. But what I found over time is those are really symptomatic issues in organizations. And a couple of years back, we stepped back and said, hey, what is going on in organizations? Because, the success or failure of all of those programs, really hinges more on the leadership capabilities of the CEO and the executive team than it does almost anything else in the organization. And so, we really started thinking, what are those characteristics and qualities of the really successful CEOs and executive teams that we're working with that really makes a difference in improving culture and improving organizations and their ability to grow exponentially. Right. And so that's really kind of what we're focusing on right now. And, I'm telling you, this leadership issue is critical to organizations going forward. And it's something that just isn't getting a lot of focus right now.
Right. And so, when you talk about, you lead people and you manage processes, obviously some organizations, you need leaders and you need managers, right? You got to have people that are, blocking and tackling, and people that are actually leading and involving the organization. But if you have that philosophy, you kind of understand the differences and so forth. How do you start measuring that for day one, right? Because you have all these different generations coming into the hiring funnel. And for certain positions, you need leaders, right? And for certain maybe positions, you need managers. So how do you measure differently in the hiring process for leaders versus managers?
Yeah, some of that kind of comes back to, are leaders born or can you create them?
Right.
It's always the huge question. And I'll tell you.
What do you think?
I'll tell you, I think, from my personal perspective, if I go back and look back in my whole life, and just even as a kid, I played a lot of sports growing up, and I don't think there's ever been an environment in my younger days or even, today where I'm not kind of always wanting to be the leader in whatever it is I'm doing. So I'm going to say born.
I agree.
I just do. I think there are times when people that aren't born as leaders can certainly step into leadership roles, but I think there's something really innate in leaders.
Yeah.
And you see it. And I think I see it more now in the interview process than I probably ever have. And frankly, when you see it, I think now it's kind of rare.
That's why I think, yeah, it is.
I think it's rare. I think it's really
rare. I think too, when a lot of companies talk a lot about culture fit, right? Mm-hmm. But part of what I talk a lot about too, not only the culture, is the grit, right? Because a lot of the grit is you're born with it too. When you're talking about people, work ethic and ability to, tackle anything and that kind of too. I think that stems a lot from not as much if you're born with it, but it's kind of how you're raised, right?
Yeah. It's that competitive nature too. I think it's the wanting to succeed and just sticking with it until you do.
Yeah.
I think there's, stickiness that happens in there too with leaders that you don't necessarily see with other people. So, and there's a lot of different factors to that. And that's one of the things that, we're really taking a look at, because again, organizational problems right now, I think most of the time are happening because of a lack of leadership. A lack of somebody willing to stick their neck out and actually
that's big.
Be definitive, put a stake in the ground and say, this is where we're going. This is where we're heading. Let's get there. A lot of people are trying to be too accommodating to everyone in the organization, and subsequently decisions aren't being made quick enough. There's just a lot of factors involved in it, but you can tell in the hiring process, I think pretty early on, whether or not somebody's a leader or manager. And this is kind of how to summarize it, this is kind of what I'm looking for. A leader is going to be future forward thinking. Mm-hmm. They're going to be asking the questions like, where do you want to go in the future? What's the long-term game plan? How do I fit into that picture? How can I help in that way? And managers are going to be looking at your things historically, like, well, how have you done up to this point? What are the numbers? What's the track record? Where, you started here and you've got, 5 years ago when you started the organization, it was here and now you're there. They're not as forward thinking necessarily in their conversations. And so I think that's kind of the initial litmus test I use when I'm kind of saying, well, is this person going to be more of a leader type or more of a follower manager type?
Right.
And that's really what I'm looking for. And you hit it, the nail on the head earlier. We've really noticed that people don't want to be managed. You hear the phrase micromanagement. It's always used in the negative sense, right? People don't want to be managed. They want to be led.
Right.
And we're just really missing that.
There's got to be, the excitement, the passion. I think when people talk a lot about, passion within employees, most people don't wake up and just say, hey, I'm going to have an amazing day and I want to be passionate today about my work, right? It's the vibe and the direction and the excitement from the leader and being able to paint a bigger picture than today.
Yeah. And understanding how you fit into that.
Exactly. Right? Like everybody wants, whether you're a leader, a manager, or a doer, right? Everybody wants to be a part of something. And I think it's a good leader makes sure that by painting a vision and getting excitement that everybody can kind of see their individual role in a bigger picture. I think corporations have, to your point earlier, nobody wants to stick their neck out. I mean, that's the problem I've always had with corporate America, right? It's like nobody wants to go out on the limb because if something doesn't work, they're like, oh, they're so worried about being on the chopping block. I think that is a big difference too between a leader and a manager.
Absolutely.
A manager is worried about their career path of if they did take a risk and it doesn't work, where a leader's like, there's no backup plan. This is going to work. Like, I'm going to make this happen. I think that's a big difference too when you look at big corporations and like really moving the needle. There's not enough people that are actually willing to go out on the limb and take the risk to move the needle.
Yeah. And I don't even want to go into the why behind that, but yes, that's absolutely the case.
Yeah, exactly. So we talked a little bit about, some of the thoughts on hiring, leaders versus managers, but what about when you're looking at your organization and of the people you have in your, maybe you have a big mission of hiring from within and internal promotion and kind of assessing, how to take employee career paths. How do you really look at the current workforce? Obviously, to your point earlier, you can ask the questions, whatever, but what, are some tips of where to start looking at your employees of who to be grooming to take them to leadership roles versus manager roles?
It's interesting you ask that because, as we kind of talked about earlier, you can't have a whole bunch of chiefs and Indians. Like, you got to have like a whole bunch of people that are doing the work and managing the work, and some people leading the work. So you've got to make sure that obviously your workforce is kind of balanced out and all in that way, because, you just can't have everybody leading or everybody following. So that's the piece. So when you're actually taking a look at people that are ready for promotion, there's a lot of things you got to factor into that. Certainly, I think when talking to peers and supervisors, it becomes pretty apparent early on who the leaders are in organizations.
Right.
It's kind of that social network analysis thing that kind of became popular, 10 or so years ago, where if you ask people in the organization who you go to get information or to lead the organization or to lead a team, or, whose team do you want to be working on, if you could pick anybody in this organization, those people, from a social perspective within the organization, will kind of rise to the top. People know who those people are.
Right.
And I actually think most of the time it's almost better to ask people that are doing the work in the organization, who they would follow, whose team they love to be on and why. Those are the people that I think I would really look at.
That's a good point.
It's a lot less about, okay, well, this person's checked all these boxes for management. Now let's move them to leadership. Because we've all seen plenty of people who are really good at managing tasks and projects and whatnot, but are not good people leaders.
So that brings up the question then, does a leader have to be really liked within the organization, right?
Okay, so that's a great question. And here's my take on that. So I think a good leader in today's environment, we're kind of moving from, we've been taught leadership from what I'm going to call kind of an industrial and management from an industrial age model.
Right.
All the classic, business school models teaching leadership and management are all from industrial age education. We've kind of moved into this information age that required us to, manage knowledge, but we're actually now moving very quickly into what I'm going to call kind of a relationship age, where you do need to be respected. You don't necessarily need to be liked.
Right. I've always said that. I mean, there has to be likability, right? Nobody's going to have someone that they just absolutely hate, right? But you have to, managers typically want to, not ruffle any feathers, right? Everybody, likability, whatever. Leaders, you can still be likable and gain respect, but know where to draw the line, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're not here to be everybody's friend in a leadership role. It's just not happening.
Yeah, you can't host every happy hour, and you can't be everybody's friend, right?
Right.
From that perspective. The other thing I think is interesting, we have an ebook coming out next week, and we were doing some research because, you've got huge, millennials in the workforce that's going to take over by next year. And then you've got, especially for folks hiring frontline employees, you've got Gen Zs that are in the workforce that are completely different than millennials, right? Mm-hmm. And it was interesting to me that I think it was, I don't know, it's in our ebook next week, but 72 or 74%, whatever it is, it's a high number of Gen Zs say they want to be led by millennials and not baby boomers or Gen Xers. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Was it philosophy on how they lead or manage people, or was it purely just, they don't want it, just an age thing, Yeah,
it's going to be really interesting. And I think it'll be really interesting when Gen Z gets into the workforce that are managed by millennials, and let's see what they decide once they're actually in that environment.
We're really screwed, right?
Well, it's funny because I just sat in this last weekend. I just sat in a whole bunch of sessions around both millennials and Gen Z and the differences between the two. And I actually happen to have two Gen Zers in my house at the moment. And but I work with millennials in a lot of different ways. And so it's fascinating to me because I can clearly see the differences between the two.
Oh yeah,
and and so I don't know. I think that with millennials, we have got to start teaching them leadership, like true leadership skills. If somebody asked me, what is the number one issue? What's the one thing that kind of rises to the top when it comes to leadership issues like baby boomers and Gen Xers who are leading organizations now? What's their biggest issue? It's the millennial issue.
Right. Absolutely.
It's understanding how to lead them and manage them because, we're not really managing that. That is the problem. We want to manage millennials and that's not working out so well.
I think that's a great point.
So that is the problem right there. So we need to lead them, not necessarily manage them.
I think that's a great point because a lot of the issues that everybody has with millennial employees goes around this work-life balance and work ethic and all that kind of stuff. And if you're trying to manage that, it causes friction versus leading them to have a greater cause to want to work more hours or want to be more invested in a company. So
and it's
really good.
It's really requiring leaders to really rethink how they lead. I mean, that's ultimately what it comes down to, because I think I saw a stat over the weekend, 75% of the global workforce by 2025 is going to be millennials.
Yeah, in the US, they're saying it's 2020 next year, which is like 6 months away, right?
Yeah. And
then I think it's by 2025, 75% of the C-suite will be millennials.
Yeah. It's funny. I just heard about 3 or 4 months ago, I had a CEO who was just really frustrated with this whole issue. Just tell me, well, you know what? They're just going to have to do what I want them to do because I'm the CEO. And I literally just laughed. I'm like, you got to be. And I told him, I said, you got to be kidding me. Like that, that is not going to work well for you.
There's days, I'm sure every CEO, there's days that I say that in my head, but I don't say it out of my mouth, right? And you can't act like that. But I think everybody, regardless of being a CEO or not, has those days where it's like, okay,
I'd love that to be the case, right? Like that was my parents' philosophy. Like, it's my house. You do what I say. Yeah, I can't even pull that off with my Gen Z kids anymore. I've got to explain to them the why, and that's just a great.
That's a whole other podcast. Oh my gosh!
Right? Oh yeah.
About that, right?
Absolutely.
One quick thing before we wrap up and bring Caroline onto the show. You do a lot of work around creating, as you say, kick-ass cultures. Tell me a few ingredients that defines a kick-ass culture to close out your time on the show with us today.
Yeah. So, we've already kind of talked about one, which is the leadership. The executive of the organization has got to be clear and decisive. I think that's like the number one thing. Without that, the rest of it gets really just exponentially harder. So there's some keys around leadership and leadership qualities moving forward. The second one in this kind of relationship economy we're moving into is really understanding the innate strengths and superpowers of the people that are in your organization. It is not about fixing the things that people don't do well. It's identifying what they do exceptionally well and having them do more of that. And so a really great leader is going to be like the captain of a team or a coach of a team that understands the strengths of all of their players and then plays them appropriately. That's really the kind of leadership we need going forward. And knowing people's strengths would be the second big one. And the third one is kind of the linchpin to all of it, which is leaders need to set and align and communicate their internal values. It's kind of like the internal playbook of how we all want to play together internally as a team. Mm-hmm. What does that look like? For a sports analogy, for people that are into football, it's the difference between running a team, a tight-knit team where you're not going to let any shenanigans off the field or off the court happen versus teams that let that stuff happen and don't really, rein it in. Some CEOs are cool with, whatever happens, and others have a really set, clear internal set of values that they want people to live by within, internally.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think especially you'll see companies from a culture perspective that are doing more things in their local community and defining those values, both in the workplace and then outside the workplace as an example, which is doing a lot, great from a leadership perspective. We talked a lot on the show about that. And so that's been really good for some of the leadership too. Well, cool. Amy, tell everybody where they can follow you on social to stay tuned for the book coming out.
Yeah, absolutely. So LinkedIn, it's just Amy Riccardi. That's kind of the moniker. You can find me pretty much everywhere. Twitter, Amy M. Riccardi, and HCM 2020 as well. And I'm just really excited to be here. Thanks so much.
Well, great. Thanks for being on the show. And we'll move to talk to Caroline. Thanks, Sammy.
All right. Thanks, Carrie.
Hello, Caroline. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Carrie. Great to be here with you.
Well, awesome. We talked earlier about your role at Korn, Ferry, and all the stuff that you guys are doing over there. You guys have such a diverse workforce, over 10,000 employees in 80 countries. And I'm assuming this is across so many different job levels, from your entry-level folks up to senior management. And that makes hiring pretty tough because you have to look for future leaders and managers to be able to run an organization that big. Tell me a little bit why it's so important to not only be recruiting and hiring for those managers, but also looking for those, current and future leaders.
Yeah, sure. And definitely the complexity of a diverse workforce keeps us on our toes. I think, managing and leading are definitely two different things. And when we think about in our hiring practices, as well as we're developing our people, from a talent development perspective, I like to think about, kind of what gets measured gets managed, right? And so you can't have everybody wanting to be a leader, which is fine. I think it's sort of like the structure of an organization as a pyramid. So smaller at the top. And you want to have a good base of managers. So you can't have everybody kind of wanting to be in those top jobs.
Right.
And yeah, so you can't have everybody wanting to be at the top. We don't want that either. And not everybody's cut out to be that. And with our diverse workplace, we've got people on site at clients. We've got people in offices, people who travel, people working from home. And so that also brings a complexity of skills that we need as well. And so we're looking at our hiring practices, both in kind of the competencies that we're looking for and trying to develop, as well as the types of people where we're looking for those people, how we're looking to attract them, how we're looking to retain them. It's kind of all different ways that we look at that and bringing people in.
Yeah, no doubt. And you made a comment when we chatted before, we were talking about just how critical retention is, especially with this competitive kind of candidate-driven market that we're in right now, that people leave managers, not companies. And I think that's really critical when you think about it, of, having such a large organization. How do you really ensure kind of top down, bottom up, that managers are representing the company's core culture, values, everything, when you're looking at as an organization of, how to reduce attrition, how to retain employees? How do you make sure, based on that comment, that managers are kind of carrying that torch forward to represent the company?
Yeah, it's tough, right? It's never easy. A couple of ways that I try to do it. I talk a lot in the different trainings, and whether it's, individual conversations or wholesale trainings that we do, to me, it's a shared commitment. Nothing that we do today can be all on one thing. And what I mean by that is it's not fully the company's responsibility. It's not fully, me as in the HR organization's responsibility. It's not solely on the manager, solely on the employee, right? So it takes kind of all those four constituents and populations working together to kind of make it work. And frankly, when one of those is not fully working at its full capacity, you feel that. And so I can develop the best, programs in the world, and I can develop the best training practices or compensation programs or performance management or platforms or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, if our managers and leaders aren't living that every day or reinforcing or communicating that, and if our employees aren't, feeling that they're valid or taking the time to use those tools that we have, it doesn't work. And so, I talk about sort of the lens of the manager. Our employees see that experience through them. I can't be in all those places that you mentioned every day. I'd love to be. But I can't be there every day, working with every employee. And so that experience really kind of comes through the experience that our teams have every day with their leader that's on site. And so we talk a lot about, I definitely have accountability and ownership for making sure we continue to improve those tools and invest in the talent space for the firm as we grow and develop. But at the end of the day, I do absolutely believe that people, their everyday experience comes from their interaction with their leader, their manager, their team, right? And I also talk a lot about with both our employees and our leaders about think back to, the best experience that you had in your past. Typically you're thinking about a great team, a person who motivated you, a person you had fun with, and that can change over time too, right? You have different drivers and experiences over the course of your career, different things that meant something to you that maybe today wouldn't mean as much, whether it's a different phase of your career or a role you had. And what was that? So kind of using that lens and experience to drive as you become a manager or leader and shape kind of what you want to be known for and how you lead teams.
Yeah, and that begs the question, with 75% of the workforce going to be millennials by 2020, which essentially is 5 months from now, right? Yeah. We used to say that it was like, seems so far out. Now it's like, hey, we're down the months versus the years. But when you think about that, some millennials have been in a, manager type role before, and maybe some have been leading, but there's a lot of leadership training and development that demographic needs today and will continue to need, as well as the Gen Zs that had, just started entering the workforce. Does that make you think differently about kind of what's to come? Like, does there need to be a more emphasis on leadership training, management training? Does that kind of change things in your mind of some future development that may be needed more now than in the past, or is it the same?
Yeah, it's funny. I was actually just reading about Gen Z. I'm like, oh gosh, I gotta get caught up here. And the stat was funny. Like 2020 is around the corner. The stat was 30% of the Gen Z will be in the workforce in 2020. I gotta catch up here.
Yeah,
and interesting.
It's crazy.
Yeah. And interesting too, the pace of change in the world, right, is so much more rapid than it used to be, that the gap between the generations is that much further, right? So the differences between like our grandparents and their grandparents, was much not as great as now the generations coming in. And so with the movement of technology and the way the world changes and the pace of change, as well as the types of changes. So, I mean, who can keep up? It's a full-time job, but I think also people are living longer, right? Staying in the workforce longer. And so I would flip it to say, I think the challenge that we have as, talent professionals or leaders, I think it's an added challenge for talent professionals to have an added responsibility for it, is you've got to have things that appeal to multiple generations, right? So you've got people staying in the workforce longer. And now you've got multi-generations, and everybody learns differently, has a different approach. I was reading something the other day about kind of throw out the rule book, right? So traditional hierarchies, traditional like policy, procedure, handbook concept. And I'm not saying, go rogue here. You've got to do what works for your industry or culture to some extent. But I think the concept of sort of the old school way of doing things is a little bit out the window, so that you can appeal to all generations, as well as, oh, by the way, we're all very resource constrained. Yeah. People are typically doing 2, 3, 4 jobs. You've got then layer in global complex organizations for those companies that are, if you're public, all that good stuff. So I think it's more also, how do you put things in place that are going to appeal to diverse workplace, and that's diverse in all sense of the words, right? Generation, again, multiple geographies. You've got, in our case, we've got people in on-site at client traveling in a traditional office, in delivery centers. And so you're faced with that challenge as well. Some people learn on the go, they listen to podcasts, they want to read a one-pager. They want to, listen to something on the train ride home. They want to sit in the classroom, but sort of gone are the days of like, oh, we're going to have a 1-week training and fly everyone in kind of a thing.
Right. And I think, mentioning Gen Z, the other thing that's interesting, we just highlighted it in an ebook that we had come out this week, is that 73 or 74% of Gen Zs want to be managed by a millennial, not a Gen X or a baby boomer, which is kind of interesting in the fact of,
yeah, for sure.
You got young, finishing young, right? But, some millennials are 40, so I guess it's not too young, but it's kind of interesting when you think about, to your point earlier about you really, most people in their career remember a great leader or, manager that, was impactful in their career. And so we have this younger generation saying, hey, this is the, style that I want. So from an HR perspective, as you start, pairing teams, that starts to become a little interesting as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I try to take that approach. I mean, you got to think of, it's funny, we do a startup program for campus early career. And the first thing I say to them is, they kind of stare at me funny, but, what do you want your legacy to be? Right. So it's kind of like starting from the end and working backwards. I think at the end of the day, no matter what our generation is and where we are, I hope we all want to kind of make a difference, right? Have an impact, whatever that is. And right. So when you think of that and kind of working backwards, it's being authentic. I mean, hopefully we know the basics. What do we have to come in and do every day? Check the box. Yep. There's work we have to do. That's why it's work. So above and beyond that, how do we want to have an impact? And you don't have to be the CEO to do that, right? You don't have to be a big leader in a big role. We need people to do that too, but not everybody's going to do that just by the statistics. So you can do that in small ways in different levels of the organization and in big and small ways. So thinking backwards from there is what I talk to them about that, and how do you carve that out and start doing that, whether it's through your team, through your work, through your network, personal and professional, and kind of go from there and start to create your mark on the organization.
Yeah, no doubt. And as we move into, I think we're going to see kind of a big shift in the next 5 to 12 months, I guess we can say now. And the workforce, whether it's, recruiting or how we onboard or how we train. So looking into the rest of this year, in 2020, Caroline, what's the one thing that's kind of keeping you up at night that's making you scratch your head?
Yeah, look, I think so many things, right? I mean, at the end of the day, for me, it's truly the prioritization. There are many great things, and these are all positive, right? When I am grateful every day to be doing what we're doing, and we're in a growth state, which is positive. And we've brought together many different types of business lines and solution areas. And as we mentioned, diverse workplaces, and we work in many different countries and different types of people. But like lots of companies, we do it with a small and mighty team. And so how do you balance prioritizing? There are baseline things in the talent space that have to get done that are not super glamorous. And that's just a part of running the operations on the talent side. But that takes a lot of time, right? And as the world gets more complex, there are things around, compliance and privacy, and that stuff is not getting more simple. So you kind of check the box on that stuff. And then there's a lot of stuff that's really exciting. We're trying to leverage more of our own IP and tools and technology and on ourselves, which is really fun through that process and educate our own employees on our own tools. But that's a lot of heavy lift as well. And so it just comes down to, how do you balance all of that with also trying to stay up to date and appeal to, your diverse workforce and attract, retain, engage, right? And motivate and reward all of these folks that are together. And hopefully at the end of the day, just trying to drive a common purpose. Sounds pretty and simple, but it's pretty complex, but fun. It's certainly not, it's a great and exciting time to be in the world, but it is ever changing. We talk about the talent shortage, and the technology and, robots taking over the world. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we're always going to need people and good people doing great jobs. It's just how do you you shift those things to balance with that, and stay on top of that information, make sure people are skilled to do the work and get people doing good things. But it's a lot to balance and kind of staying on top of it before time just flies by.
Yeah, absolutely. Never enough time in the day, right? Or the week or the month.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, awesome. Well, tell everybody where they can follow you on social.
Yeah, please. So LinkedIn and on Twitter at CC Werner, Korn Ferry on our website, and appreciate the time, Carrie.
Awesome. Well, remember to leave any comments if you have any questions for myself, Amy, or Caroline for the show. Please subscribe to get the latest HR podcast delivered right on your podcast player of choice. And as always, thank you, Caroline, for being on the show.
Thanks so much, Carrie. Appreciate the time.
This podcast has come to a close. To hear more from the Executive Innovation Show podcast, subscribe, submit questions, and share the love. Follow us on social. We're everywhere.